Jack Chick talked a lot about the Jesuits and the Jesuit order. He worked with Edmund Paris and his wife so Chick could publish an English translation of his French book, The Secret History of the Jesuits. It was only because of Jack that I really got into investigating the Jesuits. But the first thing I realized was this: Jesuits are not what they appear to be. I learned a lot of information in a testimony by a young man who escaped from the Jesuits in 1824. Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. Maybe once a century, the Lord allows a person to expose the horror of Babylon in its various forms. A modern example is Alberto Rivera. An 1800s example is this young man, Jacopo Leone. Let me tell you his story. Jacopo Leone was a child prodigy. He had a special talent. In the early 1820s, he had invented a form of shorthand. He liked to daydream in class, but he could be called upon at any moment. So he quickly wrote down in abbreviated form every word his teacher said. Then, when he caught him daydreaming or reading another book and told him to recite what was just said, he could recite it word for word. Frustrating, but brilliant. The problem was, even in the 1820s, schools more existed to squash creativity than to encourage it. There's only one exception to this rule that Jacopo knew of: the Jesuits. So, 19-year-old Jacopo finished his studies at the seminary of Vercelli. Then he spent some time with Luigi Guarelli, archpriest of Langosco, halfway between Turin and Milan in northern Italy. Luigi recommended that he try to gain admittance into the Jesuit order. According to Luigi, quote, "None were admitted but such as were distinguished for intellect, wealth, or station." That inflated his ego. So he wrote to Jan Philip Rotan, S.J., a Dutch priest who is rector of a Jesuit college in Turin. Jacopo saw the Jesuits as the most noble of the orders. Rotan recommended Jacopo to take the preliminary exams. In September of 1824, he was met by Rotan at the House of First Probation, where all applicants are probed to see if they are worthy to become Jesuits. Jacopo had never been treated more kindly. Rotan talked with him as if he was his closest friend and confidant. Of course, that was the way it was supposed to feel. Quote, "It would be difficult for me to convey an idea of the consummate art employed to sound a conscience, to descend into the very depths of the inmost heart, and to make all its chords resound, the individual remaining all the while unconscious of the analysis which is going on. So occupied is he by the pleasant flow of the conversation, so beguiled by the air of frank good nature with which the artful process is conducted." In other words, Jacopo was being psychoanalyzed before the days of Freud, just like Alberto said, which you'll see in a few minutes. But Rotan had a larger purpose. Rotan wanted to make sure that Jacopo desired to be a Jesuit more than anything else in the world, and that he was already willing to submit everything to the Jesuit order. And what Rotan wanted was more than Jacopo's testimony. This form of questioning is described right here in the constitutions of the Jesuit order. But that's another video. Jacopo was approved and proceeded to the Jesuit monastery at Chieri, Turin, Italy. He described what happened next. Quote, "On my arrival, they placed in my hands the rules which related to the first phases of my new existence. I was immediately initiated into the exercises of St. Ignatius and of other saints, all Jesuits. It is by this sudden and complete immersion of the soul that they acquire their unlimited power over so many young men, unarmed by experience and totally without defense. What Jacopo did next was sit in silence with the windows shuttered, while his guardian angel, the father over each novice, lectured him on the Jesuit views of sin, the world, and eternal punishment. They told Jacopo that those who don't absolutely submit to the rules of Ignatius of Loyola are, quote, as an army of rebels, angels of darkness, whom Satan inspires and governs, and against whom battle must be waged, until the day of final victory by the army of the faithful, led on by those angels of light and chiefs of the sacred militia, the Jesuits. As for the enemy's camp, he spoke of nothing in it but its reeking pestilence and corruption, end quote. This, plus other exercises, were designed for one purpose: to break down the novice until, quote, each individual who has been wrought upon during a sufficient time comes at last to consider himself religiously bound to the total surrender of his own will, end quote. And it worked. In Jacopo's own words, quote, for I truly believe that the more I should identify myself with a society, the more I should belong to God. And in this deadening of every feeling which might stand in the way of my entire dedication to the order, I perceive nothing but a just and reasonable consequence of its directing principle, that the fewer ties we have with all that might distract us from our purpose, the more will be our power to persuade others to acknowledge that authority which it is the mission of the Jesuits to proclaim, as the only one upon earth which is not subject to error, end quote. Jacopo was overwhelmed at times with the loss of all things that he held dear. Yet never once did he think of renouncing the society. When Jack Chick was arranging the funeral for his daughter Carol back in 2001, one of the men there asked for the Alberto comic series. He told Jack that he'd actually taken the first year of Jesuit training. He said they were tested over and over, and each time more candidates were eliminated. Finally, at the end of the year, there were a number of people standing. The Jesuit teacher then said, those of you who are willing to submit your entire will to the Jesuit order may stay. The rest of you are dismissed. He couldn't go that far. So that was the end of his Jesuit training. So this isn't some ancient story. It's still taking place today. Back to Jacopo. Over the days, the solitude and gloomy subjects of discussion broke down both his spirit and his health. The Jesuits offered him a kind of thick wine that left him feeling kind of sluggish. He tried to fast, but they kindly insisted he take nourishment. They told him the greatest saints in the order had gone through the same thing and done amazing achievements for God. For days, he sat in solitude, on his knees, reading monks' books and meditations while he thought about the beautiful weather outside. One day, he could take it no longer. Jacopo wrote, quote, being tempted by the fine autumn weather to breathe the fresh air and enjoy the sunshine, I begged my guardian angel to ask permission for me of the rector to walk for a few moments alone in the garden. You have only, he replied, to go to him and ask this permission for yourself. You may be certain he'll grant you whatever favor is in his power. 2 days later, on an especially beautiful autumn day, Jacopo resolved to do just that. Quote, it was in the afternoon. I quitted my chamber and went to the rector's apartment, the door of which I found open, although the rector was absent. This circumstance surprised me not a little, as among the Jesuits, everything is conducted with the most exact regularity. This rector was so informal and so personal that Jacopo decided to do what he would never do. He entered the apartment. That's where he found out what the Jesuits were really about. As far as Jacobo was concerned, he'd entered the abode of angels. When he saw the apartment lined with books, he believed they'd only be the finest writings obtainable anywhere. So, since no one was around to tell him no, and he was truly tired of reading the exercises all day long, he started looking at the books. He figured at any moment the rector would return, and Jacobo could present his request to go outside. That's why he didn't hesitate for a moment to take down a book, to look at it. Quote, I raised my hand to a shelf of the library and joyfully seized a volume. To my surprise, I perceived a second row of books behind the first. Curiosity impelled me to take down the volume which had been concealed by the first I laid hold of. The name of the author has escaped my recollection, but it was, I think, a philosopher of the last century. I should have looked at it more deliberately had not a third row of books behind the second struck me by the peculiar style of the binding. What was my astonishment was when this title met my gaze: Confessions of the Novices. The side edges of the book were marked with the letters of the alphabet. Could I do less than to seek for the initial of my own name? Which he did. Quote, the first pages, written probably a few days after my arrival, contained a rough sketch of my character. I was utterly confounded. I recognized my successive confessions, each condensed to a few lines. So clear and accurate was the appreciation given of my temperament, my faculties, my affections, my weaknesses, and my strength, that I saw before my eyes a complete revelation of my own nature. What surprised me above all was the conciseness and energy of the expressions employed to sum up the characteristics of my whole being. The favorite images I found in this depository of outpourings of all sorts from the heart of ingenuous youth were borrowed from the materials used in building: hard, fragile, malleable, coarse, precious, necessary, accessory, a sort of figurative language, which had kept fast hold of my memory. I only regret that I could but glance with the rapidity of lightning over the pages that concerned myself. Yet this glance sufficed to reveal to me the object of such a work. An idea may be formed of it from the passage I'm about to cite, and of which I've retained an indelible remembrance. Quote, the amount, enthusiasm, and imagination with which he is endowed, said the text, might in time be made very useful in varnishing our work. His want of taste for the grotesque in religion will do no harm, but it proves that his talent must be employed in recommending and exalting to the more delicate consciences all that is pure and ennobling in religion. He'd spoil all if we were to let him work on the clumsier part of the edifice, whilst he will greatly aid its advancement if he's employed exclusively in the more delicate parts. Let him be kept, therefore, in the upper regions of thought, and let him not even be aware of the springs which set in movement the vulgar part of the religious world. It is important that he should always have near him, in his moments of depression, someone to cheer him with brilliant anticipations. But should his ardor, on the contrary, lead him too far, some discouragement or disappointment must be prepared for him in order to mortify him and keep him in subjection. End quote. He continues, not an atom of what I had as a matter of conscience revealed to my guardian angel or confessor was omitted in this register. When I recollect what sweeping inductions were drawn from the trifles which I consider myself bound to communicate, I cannot wonder that such a system, so based on profound study of character, pursued with so much assiduity and constancy, and applied on so vast a scale to individuals of every age and every condition, should place in the hands of the Jesuits an almost infallible means for attaining the end to which they have proposed themselves with such extraordinary determination. End quote. Jacopo started to think back over the statements he had heard over his lifetime about the sinister nature of the Jesuit order. Never had he thought they could be true until now. Even his doubts about the so-called miracle stories told him had been related to the rector. He was an open book, and his personality was set down in this open book. Jacopo was so intrigued. He grabbed another book that caught his eye called The Confessions of Strangers. And here was Jacopo's first major discovery. Quote, I hastily read over a few lines, here and there, and the small portions that I read induced me afterwards to believe that everything in this order is done conformably to the rules of that little code known by the name of Moneta Secreta, or secret instructions. It was, in fact, a collection of notes upon the persons of every class, of every age, rich men, bachelors, etc. Here again were circumstantial details, propensities, fortune, family, relations, vices, and virtues, together with such anecdotes as were calculated to characterize the personages. It is only in cases of exception, as I have since learned, that a Jesuit remains long in the same place. If he be allowed to continue his sojourn there, it is only when the superiors are convinced of the incontestable utility of the influence which he exercises. Whenever a Jesuit, particularly one of moderate abilities, has used up the resources of his mind in any particular place, and when he seems to have nothing new to produce, the regulations of the order require that he should be placed by another, who may in his turn be remarked and admired for a longer or shorter time. In these frequent changes, there's another advantage. The newcomer, entering upon the sacred office of his predecessor, as soon as he's learnt the names of the persons who choose him for the director of their conscience, can, by means of the register of confessions, furnish himself in a few hours with all the experience acquired by his colleagues. This artifice endows him with the infallible power of surprising, confounding, and subjugating the penitents who kneel beside him. He penetrates them most unexpectedly, and, in a manner unprecedented, introduces himself into the most hidden folds of their hearts. It cannot be told with how much art the Jesuits profit by the astonishment they thus excite, and how adroitly they turn it to the advancement of their work. Thus I have met with rich bigots, old men, and often with young persons of the weaker sex who boldly maintain that the greater number of these reverend fathers are actually endowed with the spirit of prophecy. End quote. The Jesuits weren't just psychoanalyzing him, they were doing this with every single person they met, putting it into code in books like these. In a future video, I'll tell you another story about a Jesuit who showed these things to a Dominican priest. Think about what can happen now with the advent of computers and the internet. When Alberto said the Vatican had a database on everyone, he wasn't just making it up. Even in the 1800s, and probably back to the 1500s, this was going on paper and in code. Jesuits are not what they appear to be. All the time, they are analyzing people to their very core to see how they can use them for their purposes. I need to stop here, but in the next video, we'll find out the second discovery that Jacopo made when the Jesuit leaders, including the future Jesuit general, returned to the room and discussed their plans for the world. Until then, God bless you and have a wonderful day. 19-year-old Jacopo Leone was in a bind. He was a newly entered novice in the house of first probation, seeing if he had the right stuff to be a Jesuit, at the Jesuit monastery at Chieri, Turin, Italy. He'd been encouraged to ask the rector for permission to walk outside in the garden in that beautiful September. Having entered the rector's strangely open apartment, he found books to his heart's delight, especially in a small side room that he called a closet. But he was fascinated and later horrified to find out that the Jesuits had kept close tabs on him, using symbolic language, and kept it all in a book. But that wasn't all. Upon further investigation, he found another book which showed that everyone in the community was neatly summarized and even psychoanalyzed before the days of Freud and listed alphabetically. Any newly arrived Jesuits to the community could, within a few hours of reading this book, know the private lives of anyone he encountered, and especially those who came to him for confessions or counsel. Some would think they had the spirit of prophecy. Here's what Jacopo said happened next. Quote, I was meanwhile disposed to make further and bolder researches. The book which I next opened was a register of revenues, acquisitions, and expenses. In my feverish impatience, I soon quitted it for another entitled Enemies of the Society. At this moment, I was interrupted by a noise which I heard, and scarcely had I time to replace the volumes I had disturbed when I distinguished the sound of numerous approaching footsteps, as if several persons were about to enter the apartment. Then only I began to feel the danger of my presence in the closet. Until then, I had been wholly absorbed and hurried along, as it were, by a whirlwind. But the discoveries I've related proved to be but the prologue to a drama infinitely more serious, and which I'm about to relate. Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. Jacopo was stuck in a closet. And at this point, he wasn't about to come out. Would you? At least 8 to 10 people then entered the rector's apartment. Jacopo was in a tough spot. I'll let him explain. Quote, as to myself, my perplexity may be better conceived than described. I was bewildered. What was I to do? Remain? But every moment I might expect to be discovered. And then, should I open the door and break in upon their conversation? But I was much too agitated, too much oppressed by what I just read. Besides, what I had already heard of their projects, their eager animation, and the freedom of their speech all terrified me. I trembled at the bare idea of encountering their inquisitorial gaze. A fearful reaction had instantaneously taken place within me. The Society of Jesus was suddenly revealed to me in darker and more repulsive colors than those under which it had formerly been depicted to me. Confounded, paralyzed, and utterly unable to come to any determination, I remained motionless. Far from being fatal to me, this loss of time was the circumstance which saved me. End quote. Jacopo was ramping up his courage as they continued their confused conversation to walk out among the men and to be interrogated, as he suspected, by the rector. But something worse interrupted his plan. Silence. Had he been discovered? Jacopo froze. Then an authoritative voice broke the silence. Instantly, the meeting proceeded in an orderly fashion. I can only relate small parts and only one main part of the long session that ensued. Let's examine the heart of the story. The speaker continued. You are aware that we have no time to lose. Today, as already resolved, we'll enter into a general view of the interests and the plan of action by which our society is at present to be guided. In other words, This was the current plan of the entire Jesuit order. Who was this person speaking? The speaker continued, "Let our first care, therefore, be to change altogether the nature of our tactics, and to give a new varnish to religion, by appearing to make large concessions. This is the only means to assure our influence over these moderns, half men, half children." This sounds like Vatican II from 1962 to 1965, and yet this referred to something in 1824 that required a major change of Jesuit tactics. We must remember that the 19th century, the 1800s, had many crosswinds. The Enlightenment, industrialization, urbanization, the theory of evolution, monarchies being replaced by republics, calls for new Bible texts and translations, and the Reformation's continuing break from Rome. This meeting marked the Jesuits' change of tactics. The speaker reminded the group, "Bear ever in mind that our great object, in the first place, is to study deeply and to bring to perfection the art of rendering ourselves both necessary and formidable to the powers that be." This is why the Jesuits surround all the rich and powerful people of the world as advisors and hopefully confessors. This is to keep watch over them and to keep them under their influence and control. Remember, the 1540 charter of the Jesuit order stated they are to be the, quote, confessors of the powerful and the teachers of their children, end quote. If you want more information about the organization of the Jesuits, I wrote a detailed and concise summary in Jack Chick's Crusader comic, Jesuits. Jacobo was frozen with fear, while his mind raced through possible outcomes. He wrote, quote, "To open the door now and to present myself before them would have been the act of a madman. All that remained for me was to decide what I should do if I were discovered. And I thought my only possible resource, if I heard them approach the door, would be to stretch myself out on the ground, as if I were in a fit. I felt, in fact, as if I were on the point of being precipitated headlong down a precipice. In other words, he felt like he was being thrown down a cliff. Soon, all the men began to take their seats, much to his relief. Under the sound of the chairs and men moving around, he was finally able to take a breath. The speaker told everyone they must speak clearly and deliberately so that our friend the secretary may lose nothing of what is said. One of them was the secretary. Instantly, Jacobo sensed his opportunity. Glancing around his small side room, he found, quote, a small table with writing materials, end quote. His self-created shorthand suddenly became his most valuable asset. He started writing as quickly as he could. I'll give away a bit in advance. The guy who just spoke, that was Aloysius Fortis, the current Jesuit general, 1820 to 1829. This was no minor meeting. In short, Jacopo was able to write everything every person said, even noting who they were by the unique characteristics of their voices. He didn't dare look. A couple of them he already knew, but the trauma he was then under enabled him to indelibly remember each of their voices, even years later. As Jacopo noted, quote, each one had peculiarities which I have not forgotten, end quote. One of them, with an Irish accent, took the floor. In order to render Catholicism attractive, let us strive to enlist in her cause the foremost statesmen and historical writers of our own times. Let us employ them to deck the past in golden hues, to sweeten for us the bitter waters of the Middle Ages, and to help us to captivate mankind by the most alluring promises. What? Erase the darkness of the Dark Ages? Exactly. This is called rewriting history. Amazingly, This is exactly what happened in the 20th century. While I was in Bible college, my friends had gotten out different editions of encyclopedias while writing their papers. They showed to me how the newer articles were written by Roman Catholics, which glossed over a lot of dirty Catholic history. My friends told me they're going to have to use only the older encyclopedias, since the new ones were tainted with Catholic propaganda. And here is where it was first proposed, in 1824. Later, the Irishman stated, "For I would not have it lost sight of, that our chief concern must be to mold the people to our purposes. Doubtless, the first generation will not be wholly ours, but the second will nearly belong to us, and the third entirely." Former Jesuit Alberto Vera told us that the Jesuits always worked their plans in 50 or 100-year increments. Soon after, the Irishman said, "Yes, the people are the vast domain we have to conquer. We shall know how, by marvelous stories and gorgeous shows, to exorcise heresy from the heads and hearts of the multitude. Then the Bible, that serpent, which with head erect and eyes flashing fire threatens us with its venom, whilst it trails along the ground, shall be changed again into a rod as soon as we are able to seize it. And what wounds will we not inflict with it upon these hardened pharaohs and their cunning magicians? What miracles will we not work by its means? Oh, then, mysterious rod, we will not again suffer thee to escape from our hands and fall to the earth. For you know but too well that for 3 centuries past this cruel asp hath left us no repose. You know well with what folds it entwines us, and with what fangs it gnaws us." They really felt threatened by the Bible, didn't they? An older man, grave and sedate, then spoke. "My brethren, as to the Bible, be advised by me. For our greater good, let us carefully avoid this ground. For if I may tell you openly what I think of this book, it is not at all for us. It is against us. I do not at all wonder at the invincible obstinacy it engenders in all those who regard its verses as inspired." He related how, as a youth, he had read through the Bible 6 times, only to find in it nothing about, quote, the Virgin, the Mass, purgatory, or relics. As a young budding Jesuit, he admitted that the Bible, quote, actually sets forth a system of religion altogether different from that taught in the schools, and thus all my ideas were thrown into confusion. After his confessor separated him, calling him a young man set apart, able to know higher things in Catholicism, he confided this to his compatriots. "Consequently, let us lay down this principle in public to act as if we had nothing to fear from such a book, but rather as if it were favorable for us. In private, to describe it as dangerous and hurtful, or, where this would not be prudent, to declare that it's the germ, of which Catholicism is the complete and majestic development. We shall thus provide ourselves with an arsenal 1,000 times better stored than the biblical arsenal of Protestantism." A French Jesuit in the group later described how to overthrow Protestantism. "The first thing, therefore, is to be done is to bring them, Protestants, back from the Bible to Catholic authority." Today, you cannot find many Bibles without a Jesuit somewhere connected. In the United Bible Society's Greek text is the name of Catholic Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, S.J. In Advanced Greek is Maximilian Zerwick, S.J. In fact, a Jesuit, Daniel J. Harrington, S.J., along with 9 Fuller professors, contributed to the Common English Study Bible with Apocrypha, and of course, My old Fuller Seminary approves of this study Bible. The dean of the Fuller School of Theology was the general editor. And if you don't find Jesuits, you find the work of Jesuits. And where you don't find the works written by Jesuits, you find people taught by Jesuits. And where you don't find people taught by Jesuits, you find people parroting the things taught by Jesuits. You simply cannot avoid it. That is, unless you trust the words of that rod become a serpent, the King James Bible. They don't like how it threatens and gnaws at them. They are almost proverbially under every rock, or at least their influence is. After hours of this discussion, they finally adjourned for dinner, about 15 minutes before darkness overtook the small book room. Jacobo quickly rolled up all he'd written and stuck it in his sock. Then God let our 19-year-old sneak out of that room and take refuge in a church pew he was used to sitting in with his Jesuit guardian angel. Jacobo was totally exhausted and replayed again and again the words of these Jesuit leaders who started to take the form of devils in his mind. Everything he had believed had been shattered in one afternoon. He fell into a deep sleep. About 9 or 10 at night, he was suddenly awakened by someone shouting his name. He got up and was soon surrounded by Jesuits and questions. By this time, he was visibly ill, but even that was a gift from God. They were not satisfied with his answers, and he was visibly embarrassed. But suddenly, he took advantage of their opinion of his delicate nature. He wrote, quote, "There would have been no end to all this if, wearied with so many questions and making a bold effort, I had not begun to complain bitterly, groaning out that they tortured me, that I was exhausted with suffering, that I was dying." An aged father, whom I recognized by his voice as one of those who had spoken during the meeting, suddenly cut short these puzzling interrogatories. "Let me see," said he, taking hold of my hand and feeling my pulse, while the rest stood keenly watching me in silence. Then, after a few moments of serious thought, "Poor lad," said he, "he's in a burning fever. To bed with him immediately. Let the physician see him at once. I never in my life saw anyone in such violent agitation. He's in a tremendous fever." This was sufficient to put an end to their suspicions. I don't have time to tell you how he was able to escape the Jesuits, but you can read it for yourself in The Jesuit Conspiracy, The Secret Plan of the Order by Jacopo Leone, prefaced by M. Victor Considerant. It is available on Amazon and Google, at least for now. So now you know how one person discovered and later exposed the plans of the Jesuits. But what would happen if a Jesuit were so confident that he openly admitted the Jesuits' plan to a local priest? That's in the next video. Until then, God bless you and have a wonderful day.
Symbols are funny. Every symbol has more than one meaning. Sometimes the meaning is obvious, but often a symbol gets picked up by a certain group and they give it a special hidden meaning. But it only has meaning to them, not to everyone else. Take the letter G in the center of the Masonic square and compasses. What does it stand for? It depends on who you are. Some say it simply means God, or maybe short for Grand Architect of the Universe, the GAO2U. Some say Gnosis, Greek for knowledge. And I'm not saying that any of these interpretations is wrong. Another group has a special meaning for the G, and it's not in Masonry. It's Jesuit. Hi, I'm David Daniels for Chick Publications. Jesuit is spelled with a J, right? But the home base of the Jesuits is the Church of the Gesù, G-E-S-U, with a G. Gesù, by the way, is Jesus in Italian. Let me read to you from Rulers of Evil by author F. Tupper Saucy. Hold Freemasonry up to the light, and you cannot help but see the black papacy's watermark. Isn't it reasonable, given the circumstances, that the G in the center of the familiar Masonic emblem represents the initial of Gesù, the residence of the Black Popes, at the Jesuits' world headquarters in Rome? Freemasons wouldn't suspect this, nor would Jesuits. It would be information reserved uniquely to the unknown superior, who shares what he knows with no one. Quote, "Your enemies will serve you without their wishes," said Sun Tzu, "or even their knowledge." End quote. There is so much more than that he says, but I'll stop there. But is his contention even possible? A 1997 article from the esoteric Gnosis magazine tells how an influential Italian Freemason, Arturo Regini, 1878 to 1946, wrote in 1906, criticizing the Masonic leaders Giuseppe Mazzini and Albert Pike for failing to create, quote, a secret rite above all others, a sort of masonry within masonry, which would have unified the divided Masonic family, end quote. 2 years later, in 1908, a group even broke away from the main group, forming, quote, a new Masonic organization with its headquarters at Piazza del Gesù in Rome, end quote. Eventually, it became the second branch of Italian Masonry known as Piazza del Gesù. That's because of the location of their headquarters. In 1921, Regini joined the Supreme Council of 33 of the AASR, Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite, in Piazza del Gesù at number 47. What's so interesting about that? It just happens to be across the street in the same plaza as the Chiesa del Gesù, the Church of the Gesù, which also happens to be the world headquarters of the Jesuit order. Now, Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, or AASR, when written in Italian, would be the reverse. Rito Scozzese Antico et Accettato, or RSAA. Well, guess what I found across the street from the Chiesa del Gesù, the Church of the Gesù? See the RSAA and see the double-headed eagle? That is a symbol for the 33rd degree that the RSAA uses as its symbol. And see above it? If you look carefully, it's faint, but you can see the 47. In fact, the RSAA online says it's still at 47 Chiesa del Gesù. How close are these two groups? I think the Jesuits were keeping close tabs on everything they did. What could have motivated Regini, with all places in Italy, to place it in front of the Jesuits? If nothing else, the Jesuits certainly could keep an eye on a group like the Masonic Supreme Council of 33. Of course, Jesuits don't just keep tabs on what's happening across the street. They keep tabs on what's happening across the world. In 1851, a former Dominican monk came out of the Catholic system with an amazing testimony. Giacinto Achilli was a visitor for the Dominicans. We would call him an investigator. He found problems between people and did what he could to fix them or smooth them out. He was at heart a peacemaker. That's probably why people had occasion to talk with him and even pour out their lives to him. So though he was a Dominican, he was more of a counselor and not an inquisitor like other Dominicans. In fact, he hated the Inquisition, though it was run by his own order. Giacinto had been educated in the college at Viterbo, Italy, about 40 miles northwest of Rome. His Greek and Roman literature teacher was special to him, and one day in Tivoli, only 16 miles east of Rome, they met again in September of 1833. Only this time, his teacher had become a Jesuit. Now, this Jesuit in our story had a tender spot in his heart for Giacinto. He took note of when Giacinto took his walks and started to walk with him. As they talked on their walks, the Jesuit began to take Giacinto into his confidence. Oh, there's so much he told him. But here are a few secrets he admitted about the Jesuits and the Church of the Jesuits. First, the Jesuits spoke of the Dominicans and their attempt to get information from victims in the Inquisition. Quote, "The principal object of the Inquisition is to possess themselves, by every means in their power, of the secrets of every class of society. Now the Dominicans, even with the assistance of the priests, would be altogether unequal to this task, were not the Jesuits themselves the secret officials of this police." He stated that it was futile to do as the Italian police and try to deceive people into revealing their secrets. The Jesuits are much more subtle. But nothing of this sort takes place with the Jesuits, to whom no door is closed, no curtain drawn, no veil or shadow cast over secret or mystery. What they cannot learn from the men, they ascertain from the women. What the Father will not disclose, the Son will reveal. And what the master of the house may be desirous to hide, the servant may bring to light. The spy has need of frequent and lengthened research, whereas the Jesuit arrives at the fact at once. As has been before observed, the spy is deceived by false statements, which is not the case with a Jesuit. The confessional leads to many interesting discoveries, and where this is insufficient, much is learned even from the children in the schools. People who think they're doing good by confessing and answering questions to a priest are actually doing intelligence work for them. This information is compiled, and the means of acquiring this intelligence is the simple confessional booth. How much more when the person to whom one confesses is a highly skilled and trained Jesuit? But next we learn what happens at the Church of the Jesuits, the heart of the Jesuit order in Rome. You know the Church of the Jesuits. Every morning at break of day, as the doors are opened, 12 reverend fathers ascend the steps of the sacred edifice, dressed in their robes and surplices, and seat themselves in their chairs of confession. At that early hour, who are they who present themselves to give an account of their sins? Servants of both sexes, and all the old men and women who are stirring betimes in the morning, shopkeepers and work people, in short, all those who are better acquainted with other people's business than their own. So that in less than an hour, all the transactions and gossip of the city are related at these 12 confessionals, from whence, at the termination of the audience, they're taken home, as you may imagine, to be examined, discussed, and with due caution, registered as cases of conscience, etc. I have long stated that the big temptation is for prayer chains to become gossip chains. How much more would people freely confess to a priest whom they believe holds the keys for their souls to go to heaven? Just as they believe God knows everything, they also believe that the priests are right there, close to God. So confessing to the one, the priest, is like confessing to the other, the Lord. This is so much true that they even address the priest as Father. But as Jesus said, Matthew 23:9, and call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. And it's not enough to have those Jesuit confessionals in Rome. What is done in the church of the Jesuits is also done in those of St. Ignatius, of St. Andrew on the Monte Cavallo, of St. Vitale, and others belonging to the fathers of the company. He continued, but our exertions do not end here. We supply families with servants and change them when required. Consequently, everyone is obliged by us and entirely devoted to us. What's in a letter, like the letter G? A lot of things, depending upon which group you belong to. If you're a Mason, it may mean one thing. But if you're a Jesuit, it may refer to the Church of the Jesuits, the heart of the Jesuit order on Piazza Gesù in Rome. It would take a lot of chutzpah for a Freemason to put what he considered their Supreme Council of 33 across the street from the world headquarters of the Pope's private army. So is it possible that the Jesuits were secretly running at least some of the Masonic order? Sounds pretty likely to me. What do you think? The Jesuit is the heart of a lot of things, including intelligence. But their spies don't have to torture, like the Inquisition, or deceive, like some police and other agents. They get their information freely told them by means of private confessions. And information, knowledge, is power. Where do you suppose all that information goes? Remember these books, those books that the Jesuits keep, that Jacopo found in the House of First Probation? If not, watch Jesuits Parts 1 and 2. You'll see how well the Jesuits work out in the field in the next video. Until then, God bless you and have a wonderful day.
When Jack let me write a new comic book about the Jesuits, the original name was Out of the Shadows. Here is the original proposal for the cover. After that, I asked Jack to pose in the place of the Jesuit. He was a real trooper. But we didn't want people to get the wrong idea, so another person was placed in the Jesuit role. We thought of Out of the Shadows because that's how the Jesuits prefer to operate. Here's what happened to me back in 1982, as recorded in Why They Changed the Bible, One World Bible for One World Religion. The next summer, my mom and I had the opportunity to study intensive Spanish at the Universidad Cuernavac in Cuernavaca, Morelos, Mexico. The course was taught completely in Spanish, and being thrown into a situation where almost no one spoke English anywhere for a month forced me to concentrate on my studies more intensely. On the last day of the course, my young instructor surprised me. He spoke English. I had no idea. He asked me about my Christian faith, and then focused his questions on my beliefs about the Bible. Since I had barely been a repentant Christian a year, I'd only read through the Bible once by that time. But having taken a couple Bible courses in my first semester at Pacific Christian College, I summarized Bible history the best I could. He proceeded to tell me my history was all wrong. Then he said something so outlandish about his view of Bible history that it didn't even stick in my memory from that day to this. But it was what he said next that astounded me. I am a Jesuit priest, he said, as we started out of the classroom for the last time. Then, having gotten my attention, he said to me, "We are not under the Pope. We run the Pope. what the Pope pronounces is only what the broad consensus of people agrees to. Then we tell the Pope what to say, and the Pope pronounces it as doctrine. I never saw him again, but I left Mexico with the Jesuits' words in my head and a bad case of Montezuma's revenge that plagued me for the next 2 years. History shows it doesn't take a lot of Jesuits to do the Catholics' dirty work. It only takes a few well-placed ones. This is quite similar to what was said by Jacinto Achilles' Jesuit friend about how the Pope makes his decisions. Quote, "The theologians and the confessors then are really at the head of affairs, and not the cardinal or the bishop. The Pope himself is subject to the same regulation. I smile when I hear of the popes holding a secret consistory. The Romans believe that he is then actually himself engaged with his cardinals in the discussion of important matters, whereas the true secret consistory is held by the general of the Jesuits and his counselors, and it is by them that everything is discussed and decided. And this is not all they do out of the shadows." Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. That first day, Jacinto talked to his old professor, now a Jesuit priest. His Jesuit friend concluded with an intriguing statement. Quote, "What I've told you respecting Rome, about how they learned so much at the confessionals, is equally true with regard to all other places, wherever we are to be found, in Naples, Turin, Genoa, Modena, Verona, or anywhere else. Look, for instance, at this little town of Tivoli. No one stirs a foot, but we are aware of it, and we have no occasion to go out of our houses for information. I myself have been here for 7 years. I have never ascended the staircase of any house in the place, and yet I am well acquainted with the affairs of every family that resides here. What they are doing, what they are talking about, what their intentions are, even to the most minute matters, in proof of which, the next time we are walking out together, ask any question of me, respecting any person we may chance to meet, and you shall have copious information." If you remember the first 2 videos, Jacopo Leone found books filled with the private lives of everyone in the area. He understood how easy it was for a new Jesuit to read the books and know all he needed regarding any person, making him seem to be gifted with the prophetic spirit. Well, the very next day, Jacinto put his Jesuit friend to the test. Here it is, from Jacinto's own writing. I can only put but small portions. You can always read the book for yourself. Quote, "The next day we met again. My companion was accompanied by a youth who had, I believe, the charge of a school. He was also a Jesuit and on terms of strict intimacy with my friend. The Jesuit told Jacinto about how they do the thinking for the Pope, as I said above, and then this happened. At this moment, some ladies passed us, whom the Jesuits were first to salute by taking off their hats, but from the coolness with which the civility was acknowledged, I saw there was but little friendship between the parties. 'Can you tell me,' I said to my friend, 'who these ladies are?' 'Oh, yes, I can tell you not only their names, but their ages too, if you desire it.' 'Have you ever been in company with them?' 'Never. But that does not prevent me from being able to furnish you with every minute particular in their biography.' Whereupon he entered into so many details concerning the history of these ladies that I was astonished at the extent of his information. But I was still more surprised to hear the younger Jesuit contribute his share as well, and even correct some points which the other had advanced. I had the curiosity to inquire how long this youth had been in Tivoli, and discovered that he was a Pole, and had only been 6 months in the place. A priest came by next, and respecting him, also we had a full and minute account. Afterwards, the Princess Santa Croce passed in her carriage. My 2 Jesuits made her a profound reverence, and the elder of them entertained me with the history of the lady till we reached home. Then the next day, Giacinto's Jesuit friend said this about the Roman officials. I know them all, both friends and enemies, if not personally, at least by reputation. And of every one of them I could, if you wished it, give you all the circumstances of their lives, from their birth to the present day. You may rest assured that a Jesuit, after 10 years' experience, unless he chanced to be a stupid fellow, in which case he is soon expelled from the society, ought to know far more than the most expert and practiced officer of police. For my own part, I am conscious that I possess a certain dexterity in these matters, and it is on this account that I have been sent into various places and entrusted with so many commissions. I cannot, however, imagine why they've kept me 7 years in Tivoli, doing nothing but what my office as professor of moral theology requires, and to settle cases of conscience. Still, they have given me my degree, il grado. That's the Jesuit final vow, after which you may never be expelled from the Jesuits. And I imagine I shall shortly be called to Rome to attend to other matters, to be one of the 12 who every morning at an early hour occupy the confessionals at the Jesu. Remember those 12 Jesuits who ascended the stairs at the Chiesa del Gesù every day to hear confessions? It was considered a very high Jesuit honor, and Giacinto's teacher had been granted that honor. He would be one of the most trusted Jesuits in Rome. These talks didn't go on forever. Eventually, this Jesuit was spotted talking with non-Jesuit Giacinto, and his superior stopped the public discussions and walks. But it didn't stop the private discussions, which continued on for a while. But at the point where Giacinto couldn't take it anymore and began to oppose the Roman Catholic system, all hell broke loose, almost literally. The whore of Babylon sent him to the Inquisition more than once, but out of it, Giacinto became a saved, born-again Christian believer and began speaking publicly about the evils of his previous religion. And the Catholic system did what the Catholic system does. They made up accusations against him, claiming he had abused various young women. It seems to be a theme. The bad actors accuse the enemy of what they themselves are doing. Years later, after he had spoken publicly and boldly, including in Italy, Protestant traitor John Newman renewed the accusations in writing against Giacinto Achilli, which Newman had heard from his Catholic mentor, Cardinal Wiseman. That's the same Cardinal Wiseman who met Newman earlier in 1833, who told Newman that he had to betray England to the Pope if he wanted to be received as a Catholic. Giacinto quickly sued Newman for his libel. For his defense, to defend against the suit, Newman wrote to Wiseman, seeking whatever documentary evidence was available. Here's the creative way the Wikipedia article put its own spin on the story. Quote, Newman asked Wiseman for whatever documentary evidence he possessed, but Wiseman, unworldly at the best of times, was distracted by other matters and could offer nothing. End quote. In other words, after all the slander for years against Giacinto, there was absolutely no documented evidence. Obviously, Newman lost the suit. He was fined the rough modern equivalent of over $1 million. A Catholic fund paid those legal costs for Newman. Jacinto had gotten away with revealing the Jesuits' secrets 4 years and producing the book that this information came from, Dealings with the Inquisition, or Papal Rome, Her Priests, and Her Jesuits in 1851. It's still available on archive.org, Google Books, and hopefully Amazon as well. But the Catholics never stopped accusing him. In 1853, he worked on translating the New Testament into Italian. 7 years later, Jacinto was accused of adultery. And suddenly this man, who kept going back to preach where the Catholics rejected him, disappeared. He was never seen anywhere, alive or dead, again. As Alberto Rivera both knew and experienced 137 years later, death can be the price of revealing Jesuit secrets. But thankfully, both of them had eternal life by faith in the shed blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. They were absent from the body, but present with the Lord. And now we've got this permanent written record that so clearly illustrates the despicable dealings of the Jesuit arm of Satan's counterfeit church. That's enough for now about Jesuits in Italy. What was happening in England at this time? That will be in the next video. Until then, God bless you and have a wonderful day.
Jacinto Achilli was a peacemaking Dominican priest who didn't like the Inquisition that his order ran. He was befriended by his old teacher, who had now been a Jesuit priest for 15 years. During their conversations in 1833, Jacinto got way more than he bargained for. Along with learning about the Jesuits' work worldwide on a general basis, and about their efforts in Italy, he also got some important hints about what the Jesuits' plans were for England. Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. Jacinto's former instructor, now a Jesuit, wistfully spoke of where he would like to work. I'll give you excerpts of what he said. Quote, "Generally, those who are sent into foreign countries are not allowed to return until they've signalized themselves in some praiseworthy manner. It is considered a great favor to be called to Rome, as it is also a heavy punishment to be banished from it. For my own part, I have many times requested to be sent to some foreign country, but I never could obtain my wish. To tell the truth, I should much prefer a mission to England. I differ from my brethren in that respect. Although a Roman, the air of Rome, and more particularly of the Vatican, is too heavy for my liking. My old friends have told me about how they could literally feel this thickness of evil spiritual forces in the air around the Vatican. Back to Jacinto. But tell me, I asked, what do the Jesuits do out of Italy? In France, for example, or in England? I do not suppose they employ themselves in the duty of education, the principal object of their foundation. For my part, I could never understand what business they could have, either in England or in the United States. Still, replied he, there are many in both those countries, and many more will follow. It is our desire and our hope to obtain the same influence in England that we have in Italy. Protestantism in that country already inclines greatly towards Catholicism, and will do so still more in proportion as the Jesuits gain ground there. Then Jacinto's Jesuit friend
told him how Jesuits work in England. Our success is much impeded by other priests and monks who, in their ignorant fanaticism, imprudently attack the Protestants, and thus only strengthen their opposition to the Church of Rome. Here's the difference between a Jesuit and other Catholic priests. We, on the other hand, have the art of introducing ourselves among them without exciting attention, consequently, without creating suspicion or alarm. Apparently occupied with our own affairs, we appear to take no notice of other people. We readily associate with them, sit at their tables, and converse on general topics. We never oppose or contradict what they may advance. Do they talk of the Bible? We are ready to talk on the same subject. We always, however, have some strong arguments in reserve, for which most of them are not prepared. Scholastic doctrines which the Bible does not disavow, which are received with great willingness. Jesuits do not attack, they infiltrate. They seem to agree, since they don't oppose us, yet they always have a store of arguments that take our breath away, or that sound so good, we start to question our own beliefs and find ourselves pulled in to agree with them. This happened to me at the Christian Light bookstore back in 1980. I'll read it from my book, Why They Changed the Bible, One World Bible for One World Religion. Compromise only goes one way. 3 months after I returned to the Lord in 1980, I went to my local Christian Light bookstore that used to be in the center of town. That day, standing at the end of the aisle, in the furthest corner of the bookstore, was clearly a Catholic priest. He was a young man in his traditional black outfit. I walked over to him, intrigued at his Catholicism, and began to talk with him about Christ. During the short talk, he said we must be willing to compromise on some things for fellowship between me and him. Somehow his next words carried me along like a song. I thought we were both coming to agreement on some doctrines, and all seemed sweet and rosy and agreeable. And then I walked out of the bookstore and got on my motorcycle. The bracing, cool fall air suddenly woke me up. I knew I'd been hoodwinked, but I didn't know how or why I had been so agreeable all of a sudden. I strapped on my helmet and started my bike. Lord, what just happened in there? It's the strangest feeling when you know you've been had. You feel like you've been violated, and yet nothing physical was taken. But he played on my conscience, my want for fellowship, and the false assumption that we needed to agree about anything. I directed my thoughts straight at my Heavenly Father as I started toward the setting sun down Holt Avenue. What I realized as I prayed and rode home was this: compromise with a Roman Catholic only goes one way. They never compromise. They only make you think they did while you do all the compromising. I later learned a Roman Catholic motto: Semper eadem, always the same. No matter what they look like, nothing ever changes. Back to Jacinto's Jesuit friend. Jacinto narrates. Observe now, he continued, our method of proceeding in England. We get acquainted with the Episcopalians, Anglicans, the Church of England. Our time would be lost with others, and while we praise their doctrines, we endeavor to show how near they are to our own. He then went into great detail about Anglican church beliefs and their similarities to Catholic beliefs and practices. Then he said, But it is very different with the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, Independents, and others of a similar class. We cannot deceive them into a belief that their opinions approximate to ours. Everything regarding papacy they hold in such abhorrence that, as they express it, they would rather enter into a league with the archfiend himself than with us. How then do we proceed with them? Our efforts are directed to sow enmity between them and the Episcopalians. And from this we derive a double advantage. They cease to trouble themselves respecting us, and endeavor to annoy their adversaries. Thus, from their mutual discord, we gain an increase of power. The plan is worthy of the Jesuits, I replied, but do you think it will succeed? Will they not ultimately become aware of your intentions? And may it not happen that all parties, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Baptists, Dissenters, and others, may unite and direct their hostilities against yourselves? In that case, our mission would terminate, and it would no longer be possible for our church to maintain its establishments in that country. We must, to use the common phrase, shut up shop. But such a union is impossible. You might sooner expect the dog to be in friendship with a cat, the wolf and the lamb to feed together, or the fox and the goose to share the same repast, and than that these different sects should harmonize together. But this wasn't the only Jesuit to talk about casting his eyes on England. That brings me to another man who wasn't a Jesuit, yet he was counted as one. His name was Luigi Francesco de Sanctis, who is privy to a lot of priests' private information. Here's his own self-summary. Sometimes an author in his introduction wrote about himself as if he were another person. That's called third-person writing. Quote, "He is by birth a Roman, and lived for 22 years in a community of priests affiliated by the Jesuits, with whom he was on the most friendly terms. For 15 years he filled the office of confessor, and for 8 years was the priest of one of the principal parishes of Rome. He stood high in the estimation of his ecclesiastical superiors, and was consequently entrusted with many secrets and missions of considerable delicacy." First, Luigi lived for 22 years with priests affiliated with the Jesuits. Second, he became friendly with them. Third, he listened to confessions for 15 of those years. Fourth, for 8 years, he was a priest in one of the main churches in Rome. Fifth, he was so esteemed that he was entrusted with secrets. Sixth, he had to take care of very delicate issues among those priests. He, Luigi, was the select preacher or confessor of almost all the monasteries in Rome. As the professor of theology, the censor of the Theological Academy in the Roman University, and an associate in many other academies, he was frequently consulted. Cardinal Micara, dean of the Sacred College, and a man in universal repute, selected him as his clerical examiner. He is therefore better qualified than the vast majority to represent popery as it is. Luigi was a highly educated, sought-after, zealous Catholic. Priests, monks, and professors trusted and confided in him. He spent 3 years learning the Jesuits' exercises of St. Ignatius to grasp the deeper meaning of the Jesuit experience. In fact, he learned it so well that he got the attention of the Jesuit general Jan Philippe Rotan, who gave him his own special treatise on the exercises. Quote, "A work which I do not reserve," said he, "for the cardinals alone, but put into your hands also, since you are truly one of us." End quote. Remember Rotan? That was the same Jesuit priest that Jacopo Leone spoke to and later heard secretly when Jacopo was training to be a Jesuit back in September of 1824. 5 years later, in 1829, Ruotan became the next superior general, which position he held until 1853. It's a pretty big thing when the Jesuit superior general says, "You are truly one of us." Luigi was one of the few non-Jesuits admitted to the inside world of the Society of Jesus. Luigi continued, "In explanation of his acquaintance with the Inquisition, the author may state that for 10 years he occupied the post of examiner, or theological censor, to the Holy Office. Nothing was kept secret from him. He visited the prisons frequently, received the denunciations, and other times heard the culprits' spontaneous confessions, and whole trials have been referred to his decision. What he has said of the Inquisition has been said from his own knowledge, and not on the authority of others." Luigi was talking about hearing the confessions of people who were imprisoned by the Inquisition and accused of crimes they likely didn't commit. But what was coming next was torture, so they usually confessed to just about anything. So Luigi truly saw the darker side to the Jesuits and other priests' dirty work. Such a man was Luigi Francesco de Sanctis. You couldn't fool him about what priests did in secret. You couldn't pull the wool over his eyes about how the Inquisition ran. He knew it all. And the Jesuits especially liked him, and they told him their secrets. When he finally left the Catholic religion, just like Alberto Rivera, he desperately wanted the Christians to know what really went on in the Catholic system and what was in store for them if the Catholics ever regained power. In 1852, De Sanctis published his book, Popery and Jesuitism at Rome in the 19th Century, with remarks on their influence in England in 20 letters. In short, he created fictional characters in order to tell about the historical fact. That's the same thing that Chick Publications does with the Crusader comic series. In this form, Luigi ultimately exposed the Jesuit order, showing how the Jesuit gradually became disillusioned with Jesuitism and Roman Catholicism, ultimately coming to faith in Christ. When you read his book, it looks like letters from Henri, a young Genovese Roman Catholic studying divinity in a Jesuit seminary in Rome, to his friend Eugene, a young Protestant in Geneva. With that background, listen to what Luigi revealed about the Jesuits' purpose in England through the character Henri. Despite all the persecution they, the Jesuits, have met with, they have not abandoned England, where there are a greater number of Jesuits than in Italy. That there are Jesuits in all classes of society, in Parliament, among the English clergy, among the Protestant laity, even in the higher stations. I could not comprehend how a Jesuit could be a Protestant priest, or how a Protestant priest could be a Jesuit. But my confessor silenced my scruples by telling me, Omnia munda mundis, all things are pure to the pure. And that St. Paul became as a Jew that he might save the Jews. It was no wonder, therefore, if a Jesuit should feign himself a Protestant for the conversion of the Protestants. In other words, Jesuits pretend to be Christians, like a spy among his enemies. That is not what Paul talked about. Being respectful to people in different religions was completely different from deceitfully pretending to be of a different religion. The English clergy were formerly too much attached to their articles of faith to be shaken from them, and so the Jesuits of England tried another plan. The Church of England was created based upon 39 articles of faith. The Jesuits decided they wouldn't attack them. Instead, they did this, quote, to demonstrate from history and ecclesiastical antiquity the legitimacy of the usages of the English Church, whence, through the exertions of the Jesuits, concealed among its clergy, might arise a studious attention to Christian antiquity. In other words, undercover Jesuits got the Anglicans to debate about the so-called Church Fathers, in trying to see if they were following historical Christianity or not. Luigi continued. This was designed to occupy the clergy in long, laborious, and abstruse investigation, and to alienate them from their Bibles. How did the Jesuits plan to turn England back to Rome? By getting the Christians so distracted about what early church writers thought and what it means that they totally forget about using and trusting their Bibles. Question: how do you destroy the people of the book? Answer: by getting the people away from the book. The Jesuits didn't mind joining with Protestants and Baptists. They didn't mind letting Christians do most of the talking. But when they could, they would find doctrines that divide and let Christians fight among themselves. So they would turn their focus from the Scriptures and from their true enemy, the Roman whore of Babylon. Jesuits were glad to use any diversion that would keep Christians from focusing on the holy words of God in English, the King James Bible. Next, I'll show you some of the connections between the Jesuit order and the Protestant Bible societies from about 1805 to the present. Until then, God bless you and have a wonderful day.